All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to week 6. I know you probably watched the intro video before this, so we're just going to dive right in. So, chapter 7 of our main text, text 1, is all about the influences on corrections, but specifically, the phrasing is innovative programs in correctional facilities. And so that really is what the text focuses on. And it talks about a couple different things that we're going to go through and kind of just work our way through all of these things that the textbook brings up. And then we're going to bring out the outside ratings that I have gathered for you this week. And we're going to talk about what those look like and why this is important. So, Chapter 7 Innovative Programs in Correctional Facilities. So, across the board, these are the different particular programs that the text highlights. So, we're just going to kind of go in order. So, the Aging Without Bars program, it was a 6-week person-centered training for inmates who were age 50 and above. And the idea was to prepare them for transitioning to release. And this was done in collaboration with the Area Agencies on Aging, AAA, not the same AAA that gets your car when you're stuck. It was a collaboration between the Area Agencies on Aging and the jail intake staff. And so the whole idea behind this is that they noticed something was going on, and so they had to figure out how to deal with this. And so, in particular, this program came from a 4-year plan between 2008 and 2012. The Virginia 4-year plan for aging services found out that in prison, one of the highest concerns was that the older prison population, they were getting older and older, so that meant that there were services that needed to be available. And so all of a sudden they were concerned and thinking about how do we help these older individuals who upon release aren't qualified to work, aren't able to do certain things. And so all of a sudden they had to start thinking about alternatives. So again, they noticed that there was older prison population, and they noticed that was a high concern. Um, One thing in particular that Aging Without Bars really strived and strives for is to measure the impact of these kinds of programs with pre and post tests. And you're going to hear me talk about tests and pre and post a whole lot this lecture, and it'll make sense why. So, in a similar vein, so that was in Virginia, and if you know anything about Virginia and the Atlantic East Coast of the United States, Virginia, Maryland, DC are all very close. So this was in Maryland, but in DC, we had Washington, DC Court Supervision and Offender Release. It was very similar to the Aging Without Bars, as it was done with the Area Agencies on Aging, but it was specific to DC. And something that it did differently was it had a comprehensive pre screening of mental and physical health for individuals going through potential release as well as supervision, which is, probation. Anyway, in this, the idea was that if they could pre screen mental and physical health, they were able to customize the plans, the training, and the coaching that is required for each inmate. So instead of just a one size fits all, they're able to customize a particular system or program to focus on the needs of the inmate. So if you remember, we've talked about the idea of the rehabilitative model in criminal justice and in corrections. This right there is the ultimate in rehabilitation. It is looking at an inmate as a separate individual, finding out what their mental and physical needs are, and then helping them overcome those individuals. So that's actually a really like well thought out thing. But one thing that the text highlights, and I wanted to highlight it here, is that word of mouth helped the program grow. It's to a point at the time of writing for this textbook that there are families who reach out to the department for the program and try to set up things for their older family members who are inmates. Like, this is something that started as just within the system and aging population, but now it's gotten to a point where it's been successful and people, the families on the outside, are requesting it. So, like, the power of word of mouth and the everyday person holds a lot of swing with the success or failure of these kinds of programs. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge on something that might be important. So the third one that the text brings up is Virginia's chronic disease self-management education. That's what it was called. It is now called Live Well Virginia, and it's extended past just the prison population. It is used in a lot of Virginia prisons across the board, but it's also used in just elderly centers and things of that nature. And the whole idea was that this was something that needed to be addressed, again, not just in the prison population, but it started in the prison population. So between 1990 and 2013, they saw a change. They saw that the aging population in the Virginia prison system went from 822 inmates to 6,709 inmates. That is a significant increase in essentially what is 23 years, not 13, sorry. But that is a lot. That is a huge amount of growth for an aging population. And so noticing this, they found that why that number was growing was that inmates were just getting older. That's the process of life. But they were also seeing that there were longer sentences for people going in, so there was going to be an even more rising population of elderly. And part of the thing with getting older is that your immune system changes, and so they were seeing a rise in sickness, and all of a sudden the inmates are getting sicker and sicker, and so there was a need for a health management program. So they noticed that the inmate population was increasing, which meant that they were getting sicker and needed more medical care. So all of a sudden, now they noticed that there needs to be a health management program. And that's what Live Well Virginia is. It's all about healthy living. It's about appropriate exercises for mobility and what you can and can't do physically. It's about eating well. It's all of these things. It's not just diet. It's lifestyle changes. And again, much like the DC court supervision and excuse me, offender release, word of mouth. All of a sudden, it was doing really well, and there were successes, and there was data showing that they were transitioning well and living healthier. And all of a sudden, it was like, oh, this is a good program, and so you continue to push it forward. You continue to make strides in this field to kind of help individuals live healthier. So now we're going to move away from the East Coast and we're going to go to the West Coast. And of course, it's always California. I joke about that. But California has two here that I really want to focus on and the text focuses on. These are not in the chapter order. They happen later. But so California's Community Prisoner Mother Program is in particular focused on female inmates and female prisoners. That's the subchapter that this is from. But in particular, what ends up happening is that California noticed, and this is also something that is general across the board. This is not just a California problem. This is a United States problem. The number of female prisons, like exclusively female prisons, is not as high as male. Obviously, we have the demographic data to show that, well, there's they're at a less likely rate, so we don't need them. But that leads to issues where we have not enough space, not enough room, not enough funding, all of these things. So there was a notice in California that few female prisons were available, and that something about women, there was a unique set of healthcare needs that a female inmate needs versus a male inmate. One of them, the big one, is pregnancy, and that's what this is related to. But part of this is that in most places, this is not to say that this is the absolute correct thing, but in most places, the norm is that a mother is the primary caregiver for a child. And so if a woman is incarcerated and she has children, where does that child care go? It's not always to the father, especially if the father's not around. Where do they go? And so that gets into the foster care system. And so there's complicated issues with female inmates. And that was what California looked at that data and went, okay, what can we do? And so they came up with this community prisoner mother program. The idea was that it shouldn't be to separate parent and child. The job was not to, okay, the parent made a mistake, but it's not to, they never see their children again. That's not healthy. That's not how it should be. So the goal in this program was to reunite mothers with their children and reintegrate them back into society as productive citizens. And they did this through specialized training. They were learning essentially how to be a mother, how to get job skills if they needed to find a job. These were services that were directed towards helping women in the particular areas that they needed help in, where they were lacking, for a lack of better word. And so they did this based off of the idea that there was data that showed them that there weren't that many prisons and there were unique situations that female inmates had that males did not. I hope you're picking up on the trend that I'm trying to get forward here. And then another thing that California in particular did, and this is its own thing, is the rehabilitative reform. And this is a large section from its own subchapter in the text, and I'm not going to go through every piece, but it's important to know that the California rehabilitative reform, so 2004, there was a reorganization of the prison system in general. And the reason for this in California, and that's where I'm talking about, the reorganization of prison systems was to deal with the problem of overcrowding. So we see it now nationally, and that's partly an issue, but there's an overcrowding issue. So what do? Well, they came up with a full reform system that used evidence-based treatment programs in particular to reassess who was being sent to what kind of facilities. And that is huge. And we've talked about it before, that a big part of corrections is getting the right services for the people, for the right people, so that they are getting an appropriate and effective rehabilitation service. And so this led to the finding of DARS, the Division of Addiction and Recovery Services. And I will gladly bring up the the chapter, because it is important to look at for that. But using the DARS used data that they collected, and they pushed some widespread reform. So, as I mentioned, DARS had this evidence-based rehabilitative reforms, and so this is right from the text, as you can see, demonstrated that the national research which states that in-prison substance abuse treatment followed by community-based aftercare reduces recidivism. So all of a sudden, it changed how we approached drug care. So within the system, they were getting they were getting drug abuse treatments, and then after they were released, they were put into community-based aftercare, and they found that fewer cases of return drug offenders. Um, so, in the treatment model, experts in the field included this whole breakdown. The idea was now that cognitive behavioral treatment, which we've talked about before, CBT, and psychoeducational interventions, uh, all of this helped to treat individuals with drug abuse problems. And they were now addressing those psychological issues that led to drug abuse in the first place, and based off of a needs assessment. So, what is best used for them? Trauma informed, gender responsive substance abuse treatment program for female offenders. Legitimately, the idea here is that what they did was treated they treated drug abuse as a mental health problem. DARS took the data and went, prison is not solving this problem. What we're doing now is not solving this problem. What can we do to reduce drug crime so we can reduce the prison population? And they treated it like a mental illness, and sure enough, that led to an overall decrease in this. And so they talk about the California logic model, which is risk. The logic model is how do you identify a problem and then reevaluate it. It's taking evidence-based principles and putting in practice. Assess high risk, assess the needs, develop behavior management plan, deliver programs, measure progress, prep for reentry, reintegrate, and follow up. If you do these steps with an inmate who is a drug abuser, this is a good way to help prevent recidivism, is to help reduce the number of reoffending. Sorry, it was just important to show that and give you an idea of where in the text this comes from. So, across the board, across all of those programs, something that was discussed is there was data that showed this, and so there are some other things to talk about programs that were not mentioned in the text but are equal in importance of what to talk about. And so that is that the common factors of successful re-entry programs, and actually this is relevant to not just rehabilitation re-entry programs. So the three primary common factors across the board that we see in successful reentry programs are that they start early, that they treat the clients, not criminals, and they evaluate frameworks. And so I'm going to break down what each of those means. Start early, we've actually talked about already. And that is the idea that day one you come in, you are started on your journey towards reentry. You don't wait until they're at the end of their sentence. You start on day one, that the goal is we are working towards your reentry, whether that's 1 year down the road or that's 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road. You start early. So it's not just a re-entry or a release program. It is a pre-release. You start as soon as possible. The second thing, and this comes from psychology and sociology work, clients, not criminals. You address the person, not the problem. I've said it before as the English teacher side of me. Words have power. The words you choose and how you address people, those make an impact and a difference in individuals' lives. So when you treat an individual as a client, that has a different connotation and notion than criminal. There is a clear connection that you make when you hear the word criminal, and that is something that causes a barrier for re-entry to not work. If you treat them like a criminal, you have an innate bias against criminals and you treat them worse, they're not going to change. They're not going to be successfully rehabilitated. But if you treat them like clients, someone you're working with, you're working not for, but they are your particular client that you are trying to aid and in their success, then yes, that's going to change. The mindset changes, the word changes, and the outcome changes. This is one of those weird phenomena of psychology that when you change your phrasing, it changes how things can happen. So that's an important factor. You treat the person, not the illness. So if you treat criminality as an illness, you treat the person. They're a client. You don't treat the illness. It's the same thing that we see in particular with disabilities with individuals, whether it's physical or mental. It's person first, not diagnosis first. If you've heard that before, if not, let me be the first one to tell you, it's not an autistic person, it's a person with autism. You address the person, not the disease, or not the behavior. And that's the same idea here. And then the third one is evaluate frameworks. And if you're like, what the heck does that mean? So it's ways to operate and create programs. Frameworks are, no matter what field you go in, frameworks are the base level content. It is the things that help you establish a good foundation if you're building a house. If you're building a program, you want a good framework. It tends to be from some kind of belief or theory, or it's done in some particular way. But the idea is that you use what has already been done and has been shown to work. You evaluate your frameworks and you build from that. It's the classic, you don't rebuild the wheel. Don't reinvent the wheel. It's already there. You take the wheel and you grow upon it. So evaluating frameworks, especially with reentry programs, is you look at what other programs have done. What are the basics that they have? And what you do is you take that and you build upon it. What will work for your population? What will work for your unique circumstances? And that's how we see that a lot of those reentry programs that are really successful, they start in the beginning. They treat their individuals as clients, not criminals, and they have some kind of common framework that they work around. They work around a similar model or a belief of certain rehabilitation, and that works. And so there are two other pieces that are common factors of successful reentry programs, but they're not listed here because they're not ones that are across the board. These are the ones that are across the board. These other two are close and connected, but they're not necessarily like a one-to-one. And that is the facilities, both the reentry, like the community itself, and then the prison are located in the same jurisdiction. So any kind of community services that are designed for reentry are in the same area as where the prison is held. So if they're in the same area, they tend to work really well, those reentry programs, because then you're just like, hey, look, we're in the same area. It's not one of those, oh, well, we're going to have to figure out transportation. No, you're in the same area. If you're in the same building, that's even better. Then you're like, hey, Jim, I see that you need someone. I got a client that's ready to re-enter society. Think we can get him in your program? That kind of thing. But the other one, and this is really important, it's related to that one, and I wanted to save this one for last. It's the relationship between facilities and services. When you have a positive relationship between a reentry facility or a correctional facility and a particular reentry or rehabilitation program service, if there's a positive relationship, it's not a, oh, well, that's yours and this is mine, it tends to be more successful. And that in general is a just good rule of thumb, is that positive relationships between groups make things work easier. And unfortunately, that means, and one of the subchapters of this text is, there are barriers to success. And these are fairly straightforward. Like, I don't really need to talk in depth about them, but reentry programs and corrections does not work when there's a lack of funding or resources. And resources is both like physical uh, equipment, things of that nature, but it's also people. If a facility does not have the funding or the resources to operate at the way it should, especially with rehabilitation, it's not going to work. There's going to be a lot of problems, and that's something you don't want. Um, Another barrier is efficient and effective tools to track program information. If you don't have efficient and effective tools to track, success rates, to track the data, who does what when, has this worked for them, follow up. If you don't have that data, you can't really prove that it's working. And so if it comes down to, well, how has the program been successful and you can't prove it with the data, that's a problem. Um, this is an interesting one. Lack of education and understanding of programs, not necessarily everywhere, but there are places where a lack of understanding for what rehabilitation looks like for inmates is common. They don't know what that looks like, and it's very much a traditional punishment model rather than rehabilitation. But it's a lack of understanding that leads to this kind of, if you try to pose that in that area, it's not going to really work because you're going to get pushback for implementing the program. It's always connected to education and understanding. There's also the pushback from, well, that's not how we do it kind of mentality. Um, but then we also have established biases towards the demographic. And this was coming back to what I said earlier about clients, not criminals. The words you choose matter. If there are biases against a particular demographic, and if you're in race, crime, and justice, we could be talking about race or ethnicity. We could be talking about religious. We can talk about gender. We can talk about just the idea of, oh, the demographic of an inmate is they're not meant to be rehabilitative. They're not meant to be rehabilitated. They are terrible human beings. That bias will lead to a failure of rehabilitative programs, to failures of a prison system. Those kinds of things have a direct impact. And now, hopefully, you've been paying attention closely because I have told you what the influences on corrections and criminal justice as a whole are. And those three are the general public, elected officials, and research data. And so the general public, these are the everyday people. These are, you, me, your family, your friends, your neighbors, the person you really don't like that's like across the street and staring at you from their front window because they don't trust you, whatever it may be. It's everyday people. The general public actually has an influence on criminal justice and corrections. If they don't support something, it tends to not necessarily go successfully. They're not the biggest influence, but they're a fairly good influence, especially when you consider the second group, which is closely tied to the general public, and that's elected officials. Remember that almost all of the highest level positions in CJ in general are elected officials. Judges are elected. County sheriffs are elected. Governors are elected. People that make the laws and the rules are elected officials. And they are supposed to and usually act in the request of the majority of the general public. So those two individuals together have a huge influence. They determine, whether a state approves of the death penalty or not. Here in PA, we technically have the death penalty, but our last two governors have not put forward, they've said that they were not going to put forward any executions. They were all stays of execution. So there is that. They have a direct impact on this stuff. So you may not be like, oh, I want to complain about this and I'm going to get it changed. You alone, no, but if you get it to an elected official to make a change at that level, yeah, you're going to influence corrections. You're going to influence criminal justice. It's kind of crazy to think about how much power there really is there. But one of the biggest influences that is not the general public or elected officials, so it's not a rule, but it's a, as we've talked, evidence based practices and things of that nature. This is one of the hopefully biggest influences on corrections and criminal justice, and pretty much a lot of fields, and that's research data. Research data is not just criminal justice. I wasn't sure if I wrote it down. So there are three particular fields for criminal justice that three fields of research studies that are really heavily used. There's a couple other ones that are used as well, but the three main ones are psychology, sociology, and criminal justice. Research done in those three fields are the bread and butter of policy changes and influences on the criminal justice system. When they notice that, oh, there's new understandings of addiction behavior and mental health, or, oh, we find that a particular model of structuring and types of therapy are very helpful for people who have committed a past offense. All of a sudden, criminal justice, when they try to make changes, go, what does the data say? If you can prove that there's research data that says this was successful, then you can make that change. And that's why that's an important influence. It's why I argue it's one of the most important. Obviously, some other fields are like biology, things like pharmacology, technically with like, uh, uh, chemistry. Like, we have lethal injection as considered the most humane form of executing a prisoner. That's a cocktail of pharmaceutical drugs. That means that that advancement within pharmaceuticals is why that's changed from hanging, firing squad, electrocution. We found, I put in air quotes, more humane ways of executing an individual. So, like, research data is huge. And so, I want to bring up the two external readings that I have for this week, and it's really focused just for it's focused for the research data aspect of it. So, quick note: this particular piece. So they both come from official government pages regarding correctional facilities, but in particular, this one is from very early 2000s. It does have this archival note on it simply because, well, it has stopped being updated years ago simply because, well, it's an archive piece. There's been more information, but this was readily available, and I thought it would be worth sharing. So, in particular, this one is Sentencing and Corrections in the 21st Century, Setting the Stage for the Future. So, notice we have our individual. It is Director and Professor Doris Layton McKenzie, Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland. So right there, this field, we already know it's criminal justice and criminology. So there's the research, and you go through the contents. And so across the board, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I just want to kind of highlight the contents tells you what's going to be. And so the big areas: growth of correctional populations, indeterminacy to crime control, changes in crime rates, factors accounting for the growth of incarceration, impact of the changes of, sentencings, three strike laws, examining the effectiveness of different strategies, controversy over costs, rehabilitation, intended and unintended consequences, like across the board. Lots of data that's available. Like I said, This is older data. This is archived, so a lot has changed in the 20 years since this was originally published. But it's important to note that this is how we make changes. We have this large research document, and this is the first time you've ever looked at like a research study uh, paper published. Hi, welcome. This is the English teacher side of me saying, hey, this is important, but this is also the criminal justice teacher in me saying, hey, this is how we make policy changes is by data. So this is what research data looks like in the view at 50,000 feet. You have your data charted and graphed, explained. This is what academic papers look like. This is what professional data papers look like. I'm not asking you to do one of those. The other one that we have comes from the Department of Justice, the DOJ. And this one's newer, it's from 2017, but the use and impact of correctional programming for inmates on pre and post release outcomes. And so obviously, we have something that's more recent and it's focused on outcomes in the pre-release and post-release. So remember how I said one of the things that's important and vital is having that data. If they don't have that data, you can't prove it. This is exactly what this is all about. This is about how we take that data, that particular program, and put it into practice. So how do we take the data and make it work? How do we make it work in a pre-release outcome, and how do we make it work in a post-release outcome? And again, this is another example of a modern academic research paper. And so it breaks it down into different parts. Paper reviews for pre and post-release outcomes, prison misconduct, recidivism, post-release employment, and cost avoidance. And it goes through each section. And one of the big things it talks about is there is an older study, 1974, I believe. Yeah, 1974. I was like, I know it's on this page somewhere. What works? And it's correctional programming. It was a whole study that looked at the different systems that had been in place before and the different programs and theories of punishment and whatnot, and approached the question of what works. Because at the time, remember 1974, this is during the height of the war on drugs and everything. So this was a time where corrections and prison populations were not in a great space. And so this was an idea to look and say, well, what exactly can we do to reduce recidivism, to reduce crime? So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is this is what research looks like on the finished end when you've done all the fun stuff. Across the board, what I'm trying to get here is that the public matters, the elected official matters, but the data matters. You gotta prove what you believe. And so, like I said, these are just two examples of official released through official government sites data on corrections and how that research data has impacted particular programs or beliefs. And so I just wanted to provide this to you. Please don't feel like you have to read through the whole thing. It's 41 pages for that one and 47 for the older one. They're long. There's lots of data, charts, figures, facts. There's lots of information. I don't expect you to read all of them completely, but read through it, skim through it, look at information. If there's a particular section that sounds interesting, check it out. The idea here is to learn and understand what this looks like so that when you get to the discussion board, you get a kind of little break and say, what exactly do you want to research? Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. All right. That's it. That is it for this week for intro to corrections. Like I said, um, the biggest takeaway from all this is that number one, research data, the public, and elected officials are the big influences on corrections and criminal justice as a whole. That if you want your reentry program to be successful, you got to start early, treat them as clients, not criminals, and evaluate frameworks, and that there are barriers to success, and so you should want to overcome those. Really, that is the influence on corrections. The influence is the everyday people, the elected officials, and the research data. Those are the influences. But the results of those influences are successful programs that help reduce recidivism and reduce the number of cases and reduces prison population. So it's not just the influences on it, it's the results of those influences. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful day, night, evening, afternoon, morning, whatever it may be for you. But I will see you in the next one.